So, in this chapter, what the authors do is to do a very detailed analysis of not only access, but also how deep the financial markets are and how liquid they are. Because these are three different concepts. And well, if we could see the slide. Okay, there we go.
Hello? Okay, if we can see in the right hand, we can see a chart where we provide a measure which is usually seen to estimate how deep the access to financial markets is, which is the share of private credit to GDP. And as we can see there, so this is a kind of a global sample, but if we can see the Caribbean countries, which are highlighted in green, we see a relatively low penetration of private credit to GDP, right? But that's not only that. If we go to the next slide, please. Here we have very interesting finding, because not only credit markets is what provide finance to the private sector. Right? We also have, of course, the primary markets, or stock markets, or debt markets, where firms could potentially issue debt, right, or get finance through investments in equity. And in the left chart, what we do is a comparison between some of the Caribbean countries that we cover, and first the average for Latin America, and then the average for all the rest of middle-income countries in the world. And here what we're showing is how large is the size of the stock market with respect to GDP. And what we can see that in terms of size, for example, countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, or Barbados, they don't compare back, right, to either Latin America average or all the middle-income countries. There are other countries like, for example, the Guyana and Suriname that are smaller in terms of the size. But this is not the only important thing, because we only don't need size, but also we need liquid markets for them to find firms to be able to finance. And in this regard, we do see that the liquidity of the Caribbean stock market is way below what it could be, right? So in the right chart, we see the turnover ratio, which is the measure of liquidity, or how often are securities traded in the stock market. And there we can see that we have a lot of room for improvement, right? Compared by any comparators in Latin America or middle-income countries, the liquidity of Caribbean stock markets is way below. So that is the challenge, and it's also reflected, if we go to the next slide, please. This is also reflected and it's consistent with what firms tell us, right? In the left slide, we are comparing the severity of the issue of access to finance across time. So between 2010 and 2020, the darker bars is 2010 and the lighter green bars is 2020. So here we see that across the board, among medium, small, or large firms, the severity of this constraint of having access to finance, a major constraint to business operations, has grown all the way, for every country and for every firm size. And very importantly, an innovative aspect that this chapter does is pulling all the information in terms of debt and access to labor markets to classify firms in three groups. First are firms that are fully credit constrained, that means there's no access. Others that are partially credit constrained, that they have some access, but not all what they would need to. So firms that apply to some financing, they get some financing, but not enough for what they need. So it's partially credit constrained. And then non-credit constrained. So firms that are able to get the full financing. And also, the chapter does an analysis of how more productive are these groups of firms. And we show that actually firms that are not credit constrained are 3 or 4 more times productive than firms that face credit constraint. Similar to what we found when Silvia was showing, right? Firms that are potential innovators or actual innovators, there's a huge difference in sales per worker or in total factor productivity. So that's a clear mechanism. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is another question, but I think everybody will get the answer. So I'm not going to bore you with that question, also for the sake of time. But here I'm asking,
I'm going now to the issue of skills in the labor market. How much more productive do you think firms that are able to do two things? To recruit and retain highly skilled workers, how much more productive are these firms with respect to those that are not able to do so? And therefore, the mix of workers are relatively low skilled. So as I will show later, these firms are way more productive, around similar to what we saw in the innovation chapter. They're about 80 to 90% more productive. Right? So we go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, here, this chart is very interesting. So what we're showing here is disaggregated by country, right? The share of firms in each country that report inadequately educated workforce as a major constraint to their operations. And this is consistent with what Silvia was mentioning about one of the main obstacles to innovation. Although there is variability or variation across the countries, first, we see a high average. About 60% on average across Caribbean firms, they report this issue as a major constraint. There are some countries, for example, like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that's about 40%, versus other countries like Barbados. Actually, Barbados here the winner, as 73% of firms report this as a major constraint to their operations. But across the world, these numbers are relatively high if we compare to other regions, as also Silvia was saying. Another interesting thing is that in the dots, we disaggregate this overall average by country between women-owned and men-owned firms. And here, the nice thing here is that for most of the countries, this is something where women and men all agree. Okay, so the differences between women and men, which is difficult. I have a wife and 3 daughters, so there's not always agreement between men and women. But here there is agreement. Okay, there's agreement across the board. Women, men, everybody agrees that this is a serious constraint. Okay, but this is the side of what the firm reports. There could be two options. Either these firms are, just complaining about something that is not real, or whether this is real. And then we go to the next slide. And this slide summarizes that actually this issue that firms are reporting is real. Here, when we do this is kind of interesting, because what we show here is the two sides of the labor market: the demand for labor and the supply for labor. The demand, which is the blue bars, right, is extracted from the reports in the survey, where we ask about not only the employees that the firm is employing, but also the vacancies that the firm will need to fill, and what the required level of education are those positions. And therefore, by expanding this at the population level, we derive a distribution of labor demand. For example, in terms of persons or employees with university degree, more or less the firm demands about 20% of that labor force with that qualification. But on the other side, we also measure the labor supply. And how do we measure this labor supply? It is with a totally different source. So we here get access to the different labor force surveys in the region, which is actually a survey to households, right? And to people in the workforce from households. And by doing the same, we derive a distribution of labor supply. If we see the left part, we can see clearly that the supply surpasses the labor demand for lower level of education. For example, for people with secondary education, while the labor demand is only 39%, the labor supply is about 54%. This is an excess labor supply. But on the other side, right? While, for example, people with vocational training, the labor demand is about 26%, the supply is only 5.2%. Okay? So there's a huge gap. And therefore, this is objective evidence that there's a skills mismatch. There's excess supply on the left side, but excess demand on the right side. And this is one of the main constraints, not only to sales and profits, but also, for example, to innovation. And by constraining firms in terms of innovation, you restrict even more the virtuous cycle that could occur by innovating more, having more productivity, more sales, and more growth. Right? So this is, I think, a key issue. So we go to the next slide, please. And of course, here we show objectively that the skills matter. Okay? The skills matter. What we do here is classify the firms in three groups. Firms that we call high skill, this is the right part. These firms are the ones that are able to recruit and retain more higher skill workers. So one standard deviation above the mean of the skill distribution. Then the average skill are those who are recruiting workers at the average level of the overall skills in the region. And the lowest skills are those firms who are only able to recruit workers one standard deviation below the mean of the average skill level in the Caribbean. And we can see clearly here how, for example, if we measure in terms of sales per worker, high skill firms, approximately, they report about $70,000 of sales per worker in a year. While firms with relatively low skills workers, it's about half. It's about 100% more firms who are able to recruit and retain high-skilled workers with respect to those groups. So this matters. You will go to the next slide, please. So after going through this teaser of the book, I would recommend you to go more in detail in the book. For example, in this issue of skill mismatch, the natural question will be why we observe that type of skill mismatch? And the answer is not simple. There are issues related to the quantity of education, there are issues related to the quality of education, and there are many institutional issues as well that were explored in the book, so I invite you to read it. But here we will summarize a little bit of the main policy implications and the messages that we pose in the book. So first, go to the next slide, please. Okay. In terms of the business environments that face the firms, we clearly identify, and it has been mentioned below, the issue of digitalization as a major driver of innovation that could ease the business environment of firms. Right? Digitalization of public services to gain higher efficiency and therefore a more favorable business environment for Caribbean firms. The other issue is about access to finance. One of the big issues related to this phenomenon, related to a market failure, is the high degree of asymmetric information in credit markets. In general, in the Caribbean, we still don't have a very high penetration of, for example, credit agencies, credit bureaus, or credit registries that could provide more information to potential lenders to estimate better the potential probability of repayment of firms that are applying for finance. And therefore, we propose not only the traditional measures of having better informed or better nurtured credit agencies or credit rating agencies that could get access to, for example, sources of administrative data that could, for example, give information to better able to estimate the repayment probability, but also we believe it's important to tap into new type of technical efficiency in this sort. First, alternative credit scoring system based on, for example, psychometric evaluations that have been shown to be very effective, or on digital footprints using artificial intelligence that have also been shown to be very important in terms of being able to calculate or estimate the probability of repayment with limited information as the content that we have in the Caribbean. Regarding innovation, it is very important to be able to dedicate support for entrepreneurs along the full life cycle. And here, the important thing that is relatively underdeveloped in the Caribbean is the support for the initial cycle of those innovators who may have a very good idea, could become firms that are very productive, that face a lot of barriers to be able to finance these initial investments that could spur higher productivity in a virtuous cycle. Okay? So it's very important to continue being able to identify these potential innovators and being able to enable that innovation to be reflected into higher productivity. Right? And regarding the issue of skills mismatch, it's extremely important to provide support in order to achieve one main goal, which is to align three things: private sector needs for skills, the educational offerings of those skills, and the career choice of the people who are going into the education system. First, we propose that it will be highly relevant, a collaborative scheme between the private sector and the education sector, to really tease out what are the real needed skills in the labor market that perhaps are not being adequately provided in the education system. That's one thing. Second, is also an issue of asymmetric information. When a person goes to potentially studying in a vocational training or the university degree, he or she has to choose what career. And that will be very important for these persons to know in advance what will be the expected return to those careers. Because those careers that are in low supply, of course, they will have a high return. But if you have this asymmetric information, you cannot make very good informed decisions. And some countries in the region, the Latin America region, Colombia, Peru, for example, they have started to exploit administrative records, for example, from the National Insurance Scheme, where you have, the earnings of people and match that with educational institutions and calculate, for example, average earnings of an engineer or average earnings of a lawyer. And you can provide the information to aid the career choice. That is a way to reduce this asymmetric information in the skills market. And finally, active labor market policies. We observe a mismatch between the labor demand and supply. So these intermediation services to match the demand and supply will be highly relevant to address this asymmetric information issue and this bear market failure. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So now I invite you, please. I know you have printed copies, but in this QR you will be able to download the digital copy of the book and to share openly. It's already public as we speak now. So thank you very much to all.